name is Enid Ray. I'm the chair of the White Pine Selection Committee, and I want to welcome you to today's Forest of Reading author visit. We have been doing these sessions for years, but every year, with every new group of authors, it's exciting all over again, like it's the first time. We are looking forward to thousands of kids watching this over the course of the year. Remember, if you can't watch it today, you can watch up until June 30th. Today's session will be divided into two parts. First, our nominee will do a short reading from their novel, and second, we will have a question and answer period. This will give us an opportunity to get to know our nominees and their books a little better. A reminder that voting is in April for all of the Forest of Reading Awards. In May, we will be hosting our 2024 digital and in-person awards ceremonies. Tickets are available now for our festival in Toronto, being held on May 14th and 15th, and also for our digital ceremonies, which will be released on May 16th. With us today, we have Abdi Nazemian, author of Only This Beautiful Moment, nominated for this year's White Pine Award. Abdi is the author of 5 novels, including Like a Love Story, a Stonewall Honor Book, and The Chandler Legacies. His latest novel, this White Pine nominated title, Only This Beautiful Moment, was the American Library Association's 2024 Stonewall Award winner. He has also previously received a Lamba Literary Award. His screenwriting credits include movies such as The Artist's Wife and The Quiet, as well as television shows including Ordinary Joe. He has been a producer, executive producer, or associate producer on a number of films, including Call Me by Your Name and Little Woods. Abdi lives in Los Angeles with his husband, their 2 children, and their dog, Disco. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
And
So, shall I begin with a
absolutely. I'm going to step aside for a moment and let you read a little passage.
So before I read, I thought I would tell everybody a little bit about the book. Only This Beautiful Moment is the story of 3 men in the same Iranian family, 3 generations. So it takes place in the 1930s, the 1970s, and present day. And in each story, one generation of this family, grandfather, father, grandson, are either traveling from Iran to Los Angeles or Los Angeles to Iran. And it's very much about the immigrant story, the story of those of us who have family members who were raised somewhere different, be it a country, a time, and how we piece together our own histories. And I wanted to say that because it'll set up a little bit about the reading. So the reading that I'm doing is going to be from the present day character. This story takes place in 2019. And this is a character named Mood, which is short for Mahmoud. And he is in Tehran to see his grandfather, who is ill, and he meets his cousin Ava, who is this fabulous, outspoken Tehran young woman who takes Mood to a party. And that's the scene I'll read a very short passage from. She pulls up to a quiet street and screeches her car to a halt in front of a gated home. She presses a button outside the gate, and we're buzzed inside. She takes my hands and leads me in. Music is blaring, something ambient and dreamy. There's smoke from cigarettes in the air, obscuring my view of the guests. She wasn't kidding. They are fabulous, one more stylish than the other. There's Siamak, she says, pointing to a tall, lanky, and scruffy guy. His curly mop of black hair is pulled back by a hairband, letting his open face catch the light. He quickly glances our way, then turns his attention back to the guy he's huddled with in a doorway. I'll wait to introduce you later. He looks busy. Do you mean? I want to ask if she means that he's flirting with the other guy. It certainly sounds that way. She clearly gets what I'm thinking. With a smile, she says, a lot of my friends are queer. As the smoke clears, I start to piece together what I'm seeing. Scattered among the crowd are men holding hands, women flirting with each other. I don't know what I was expecting to find at an Iranian party, but it wasn't this. Not everyone here is queer, obviously, she says, but everyone is open-minded. It's a lot of art students. I look around. So many of these young people have turned their bodies into art, experimenting with hair color, piercings, tattoos. One guy has half his head shaved, the other half buzzed and dyed turquoise. Almost all the guys have at least one piercing in their ears. Most of them have more. There are girls with smoky eyes, people who wear all black, and people who stun in bright colors. I should tell Ava I'm gay. I should tell her I've had a boyfriend for 4 years, but somehow it all feels like too much for this moment. So all I say is, this is so cool. She smiles as she ties her head covering around her waist. You see, Tehran isn't just nuclear power plants and prisons like the Western media wants you to believe. I'll stop there.
That's beautiful. I will come back to the whole Iran piece in a moment.
Right.
To start, borrowing from your publisher. Part of one of the pieces that they have out there about the book is that only this beautiful moment is a defiant statement about the beauty, fluidity, and resilienceness of queerness, family, and borders. And that's spoken to in the passage that you just read. When did you know that this was going to be your next book?
So I am very, very lucky that for the last 4 books, I've worked with the same editor, and she has been so good at helping me find the story that I really want to tell. It's often a story I'm too scared to tell. The very first draft of this book was actually not about any of these characters. It was about a young woman making her way in old Hollywood. I've always been obsessed with old Hollywood as a young kind of gay immigrant kid who never fit in anywhere. The world of, Joan Crawford and Judy Garland and Marilyn Monroe and Rita Hayworth. That was my fantasy world. And I wanted to write about it. And when I turned pages into my editor, she felt that they weren't as personal as most of my books, and they weren't ripped out of my heart the way they should be. And I totally put that book aside. I thought it was done. I was like, you know what, not my story to tell. And something happened, a situation where a white American got very, very angry at me for staying at a hotel that's partially owned by the Sultan of Brunei, where there are no gay rights. And the anger really upset me. And I always tell young writers, like, if something really upsets you and sticks with you, it means you probably have something you should write about. There's some unfinished piece. And so, as I always do, I journal a lot. I would journal about why did this incident really bug me so much? And what I started to realize is that, my family came from Iran, a country where there was a revolution when I was 2. And when you really study Iranian history and you start to understand that the United States and the UK deposed a democratically elected leader there in the 1950s and kind of played with our government for a long time, there's this dual thing that happens where you're on the one hand, you're so grateful to the West for taking you in. And on the other hand, you also have to acknowledge you likely wouldn't have had to flee your country and lose family had the West not intervened. And so I think that's what it was. It was this feeling of like, why are you upset with me? And I think what I realized is I have to finally write a book that really gets into the history, not just of Iran, but of the relationship between Iran and the US. And I didn't want to do it in kind of a way that was purely political. I wanted to do it, as I always prefer, through human relationships. And that's what I set out to do. And that's when, going back to that first draft, all the old Hollywood stuff turned into the Bobby chapters here. In this book, the grandfather character actually begins his story in the United States. He is signed to MGM, which was the biggest studio of old Hollywood. And it's very much of like a fantasy story. And then a twist happens and he becomes, the patriarch of this Iranian family. And so that was really the thing that unlocked it for me. And once I unlocked that, I was off and running. It was so exciting.
All right. So one of the questions I was going to ask you a little later, but I'll come to it right now is, so you've explained the character Bobby or Babette.
Mm-hmm.
What about the other names? Because names are powerful. How did you choose those names? Do they have a political resonance, or do they relate to your own personal history in any way?
I wish I had a better answer for that. The character of of Mahmoud I chose largely because I loved the idea of it being shortened to Mood, which felt so it felt, as Iranian people who grew up in the West were often searching for ways to make our names pronounceable. My birth name is Abdul Reza. It was changed legally at a very young age, so my legal name is Abdi now, but it's largely Abdi because the minute we left Iran, nobody was going to say Abdul Reza. So, I became Abdi. And I loved the idea of mood, which to me is it's a word that people use a lot online. They just post a photo of themselves and they just caption it mood. It's also something I have two 12-year-olds. Once you get into those teenage years, I feel like mood is just it's your entire
That's all there
being,
is.
right? So that's really where that came from, and I loved it. The Bobby and Bobette character, I think that really came out of like wanting a name that could very easily become, Bobby and Bobette are so close. And Saeed, God, I don't know that I have a really good reason for that. Saeed is the middle character. He's Mood's father. And I will say, for me, he was the most exciting character to write because he was the most different from myself. Unlike the other two protagonists, he's not queer. He actually has quite a bit of homophobia. And so writing him for me was the biggest challenge in terms of really inhabiting his voice and his thoughts. But I don't have some great reason why I chose that name. I think I just like it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So, we see the world through the eyes of these three main characters, but you've got lots of other characters like Ava, who you talked about in the passage there, who come in. When did you know that you were going to focus on this sort of familial timeline for these three characters, as
So,
opposed to bringing in any of the other voices as narrators as well for the
oh,
story?
that's interesting. So as that really happened early in unlocking this version of the book, because what happened once, I think for me, the big thing that I never thought, I apologize, I'm coughing a lot. The big thing I never thought I could do in young adult literature was write what I would call my favorite genre of book, which is the epic family saga, like a book like Pachinko, for example,
Right.
is a book I'm just obsessed with. And I think many immigrant kids have this obsession with their family story because so much of it happened in distant lands and it's inaccessible to you. And I always felt like, how could you do that in young adult? It's so hard because you're stuck to one time and place. Once I figured out, oh, what if I explore these three generations, but each one of them is going to be a teenager when they're telling their story, everything got unlocked. And I felt like a very, just a real sense of focus in terms of I found what the book was about. Because really, what the book is about is these three generations of men haven't fully revealed themselves to each other. They don't know each other's stories. And the book is about how they come together. But before they do, I have to inhabit each of their voice to figure out where did the secrets come from? Where did the resentments come from? Where did the miscommunications come from? And that just became so fun. And it felt like it really got focused on these three men. And it's
Yeah.
also really it was very meaningful to me because in our culture, Iranian culture, I mean, but American and Western Canadian culture as well, men are not really encouraged to talk to each other about emotions and history and vulnerability and how they got to where they are. There's a real masking that's happening, and that's so much of what I wanted to explore here.
So, Like a Love Story is set in New York. Chandler Legacies is set in, oh dear, was it Connecticut, Rhode Island?
Connecticut. Yeah,
Connecticut,
Connecticut.
boarding
New
school.
England.
This one, partially,
Uh-huh.
set in Iran. Obviously, there's a lot of research that goes into a book. Obviously, you have family connections. But how did situating this, at least in part in Iran, change your writing process or your research process? Did it complicate it?
Oh gosh, so much. So going back to a book like a Love Story, which takes place in 1989 and 1990 in New York, and it touches on ACT UP, which was, an incredible, was and is actually they're still active, AIDS organization. It was I wouldn't say it's easy to research that, but at least research is readily available. You can go to libraries, you can go online, there's documentaries, there's news articles, there's history books, there are surviving ACT UP members who are friends of mine who are in our community. When you're dealing with Iran, particularly the part of Iran that I wanted to write about, which is queer life in Iran, the life behind closed doors, there is none of that, because the queer community in Iran and many people in Iran can't be public about their lives. There is no documentation of their lives. And so I really had to rely on friends, family members, both for the present day Iran, but also for the 1970s. There's so much about the 1970s in Iran that focuses solely on the political events, which of course are a part of this book. But, the fun for me was calling my aunt and asking her, like, where did you guys party and what songs did they play? And what was the street food that you ate? And what did you wear? And what were people like, what were teenagers thinking about? Of course they were thinking about the revolution and about political upheaval, but this is what's so fun about writing teens. I went through it with like a love story as well. Like, and I have young kids, like they cycle through thoughts so quickly. Like 1 second you can be devastated about the state of your country and hopeless, and 20 minutes later you're dancing to your favorite song and falling in love. That's one of the real beautiful things about writing young characters. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't write Tehran as a place that exists solely in the realm of politics, which is so not truthful to any place where human beings live. Of course, politics is a part of it, but there's music and food and family and fashion and games, and that was really fun. But yes, I had to rely on humans, and I wish that, Iran had more freedom of expression, journalism, and all the things we need to really document our histories. But for me, one of the things that makes this book so special is getting to show Western readers that even though you may not think there's queer life in places like Iran, there most certainly is.
Yeah. And you mentioned the art scene and the life, and the soundtrack to this book is just fabulous. It's full of music and poetry, and I hope the kids that are reading it are going and exploring some of this and listening
I
to it and
Yes,
reading, and
I
'cause
really hope so.
I really only started getting exposed to really the Iranian stuff, maybe even 20 years ago. When I was young, I didn't, but it wasn't available like it is now either, right?
No, it wasn't. And there wasn't as much curiosity. I mean, now a poet like Rumi, who is mentioned many times in the book, is much more well known, I would say, to audiences around the world. There have been many translations. So I think I make a point in the author's note of also mentioning many of the translations have been called into question. So it was interesting actually, like the book is being translated into German as we speak. And the translator reached out to me about the poetry and what do I translate from the English or do I try and go back to the original? And
Right.
that look, like, this is why I put this in the author's note. We really can't be, the original translations have gone through so many cycles of, so we can never share the pure version of those poets. But for me it was really important to have the poetry in there because it is so big in our culture. And, we as Iranian people in the Persian community, we talk about poetry all the time. We're so proud of our poets. And, even like men like my dad, who are not, he's very, traditional, macho, Middle Eastern man who, I wouldn't say is somebody who's like immersed in the creative fields. He can quote poetry and talks about poetry all the time. It's a very common thing in our culture. Poetry is passed down and shared. And I just thought, it's those kinds of details when you're writing something that's really about bridging the gap between two very different parts of the world. It's all about finding those details that you hope will shine a light on the heart of the people, not on the stuff that you can read in, the newspapers, but, learning that in this culture, men are reading poetry to their children and sharing this long tradition. These are the kinds of details that I feel like really reveal the culture.
Now, talking about reveal. So, without giving away too much to anyone who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, what was your favorite scene to write in the book?
Oh God.
Oh,
Oh
sorry. I
my
should have
God.
warned you that one in advance.
No, 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 that's a good one.
All right.
Ooh. No, I
Let your
did.
brain
There are
work.
so many. There
Okay,
really are so many. I mean, I could sometimes scenes just make, I'm not gonna have one answer. I'm sorry. I might give you three
that's okay.
examples.
That's good.
I
Three's
think,
great.
there are scenes that make me smile because I get to incorporate a little something of what I love into a book for young people. Like, in the old Hollywood scenes, I got to tell the story of Billy Haynes and Joan Crawford. Billy Haynes was a very famous silent film, and then he got into the sound era actor who was best friends with Joan Crawford, and he refused to play straight. He was in a relationship with a man and eventually lost his contract and started a career as an interior designer because Joan and Garbo and all these Hollywood stars he was friends with hired him. And he's a big figure when it comes to kind of queer history here in Los Angeles. And so I got to set a whole scene at his house and, just explore that kind of underground queer life. That was fun. I also, the scene I read a passage from, getting to write that kind of, everyone who goes, unfortunately, I don't and can't go back to Tehran, but many of my family members do. And I've had friends, Western friends who have gone. And usually I'll make sure that they are taken around by locals. And they always, one of my best friends called me from a party at like 4 a.m. there. And he's like, I'm so confused. I'm at a party and everyone's queer and everyone's like, it was nothing like what he thought. It was exactly like this scene.
Yeah.
And so getting to write this scene that was really about demystifying life in Tehran and showing people that there is this vibrant, unfortunately hidden to us, but very real to them, community of people, queer people, artists, people pushing boundaries, that it's just, those are very special, special things for me.
All right. Now the other side of it. Which
Yes.
was the hardest scene to write?
Hmm. I think all the hardest scenes to write were the Saeed character, because, both Bobby and Mood are queer. They're both kind of experiencing versions of emotional arcs that very much were pulled from my own. Whereas with Saeed, not only was I entering the mind of, kind of the previous generation, the men who raised me, basically. And on the one hand, I didn't want to shy away from the things that made that difficult, which was that they have very different values, especially when it comes to queer life. But I also really wanted to make sure to honor their experience, their passion, their sacrifices. And I think making sure that I struck that balance was hard. And I really wanted to do it right. I didn't want the previous generation, similar to when I wrote Like a Love Story, it was so important to me that surviving ACT UP members from that era didn't feel that I
Yeah.
diminished them or didn't capture them in an honorable way. In this one, I'm so aware that, a whole generation of queer people fought for me. I'm also so aware that a whole generation of Iranian people had to flee a country, leave their families, fight for a new life, all for my generation. And so I wanted to make sure I captured that in a way that felt right.
So a lot of students who will be watching this, they are avid readers, obviously. They're avid readers, but they're also potentially writers.
Hmm.
Do you have any advice for any students who are watching who might be thinking about becoming an author?
Oh gosh, so much. I mean, this could be a whole
The whole thing onto itself.
seminar.
Yeah.
You know, the first piece of advice is just write, 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 write. It took me so long to find my own voice, and finding your voice as a writer is the hardest piece of it. I spent like the first 8 years of my career writing solely film screenplays, and I very much feel like I was trying to kind of give the market of Hollywood what it wanted, or please other people. And I think about midway through my career, I bought a book called The Artist's Way, which every writer should own. It's a 12-week course in how to unlock your creativity. That book will teach you nothing about structure. It's not going to give you prompts or tools, all of which I love. But what that book really teaches you how to do is like turn yourself into an empty vessel for your creativity to flow through you. And so it's a lot, the exercises in that book are all about journaling or taking yourself out on artist dates, places that stimulate your creativity. It very much taught me that so much of writing really is about the process of freeing yourself. But I do think when you're young, it's all different, right? Like when you're young, there is a certain amount of studying of structure that can be very helpful. I did do that, of lots of reading. Every great writer I met when I was young, who was somewhat of a mentor to me, just told me to read, read, read. Like reading is such a big part of learning to write. And also not to be too the right. I used to teach writing. The writers I feel that really do it and go far with it as a long-term career are the ones who are able to separate from their own writing. So, I gave you an example with the first draft that was about a young woman. Like I was fully ready to let go of that. And then it came back in a new iteration later. But you can't, if you put everything into one project and you refuse to move on, that could be the end for it. You kind of have to be willing to put stuff out there, let it go, put stuff out there, let it go. Writing takes time and patience.
So you have lots of things sitting about that could be coming
I
your
do.
novel.
I do.
Sneak
And
peek?
many of them do. That is often how my next novels come. They often come from a kernel of some abandoned project.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
it is
Wow.
very.
So again, in that last answer, you were talking about your experience in your life as a screenwriter. So you started as a screenwriter and you moved into writing young adult. What, why? What caused that change? Was that conscious or?
Yeah, no, very conscious. I mean, I started writing books first and foremost because I felt that at least in the Hollywood that I started in, it was virtually impossible to tell the exact stories I wanted to tell, which were about my
Oh yeah.
cultural community, being queer. That was, even now it's hard. Back then it was not hard. It was just unheard of. And so books were a way for me to tell those stories. And then the first novel I wrote was an adult novel. And it ended up doing okay. We couldn't sell it. It didn't have a big publisher. I put it out myself with the help of my agency, but it ended up winning the Lambda Literary Award for Best Debut, and it did okay. And my agency at that point was really encouraging me to find a lane, like keep writing books, but find a lane where there would be a bigger readership. And so they were giving me like advice on, you could write a thriller, you could write a this, you could write a that. And at that time, I have a cousin who's a teacher, and she was reading a lot of what was happening in YA. And so she was sending me books often of YA stories, and many of them were, one example was Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe.
Oh,
A beautiful, yeah, a gorgeous
beautiful.
classic, a deserved classic, but also a book that I would say inspired many people like myself to get into that genre, because what I felt when I read that book is like all my life I've been told I could never write about being queer, I could never write about being Iranian, let alone the junction of the two. And then here was this book that was so culturally specific. Um, and it just made me feel like, well, maybe this new generation of readers is actually going to respond to the kind of stories I wanted to tell. There was a real kind of marriage of what I wanted to write about and what they wanted to read about. And it turned out to be right. I thought I would write one and maybe that would be it. And it's become, I've written 4 young adult novels and I have 2 more on the way. So it's become like my home, really. Like I love it. And I would never have thought that I would be somebody who I go to speak at schools, I go speak to teens, I do, classroom visits, I do speeches, I never thought that would be something that would happen in my life. And it's been one of the most gratifying things I've ever done. So, really sometimes, and that's the thing as a writer, like you never know what's gonna work for you. And I think once I started writing in YA, it just felt right. It felt like my home.
Right. Yeah. So I can pull bits and pieces of the answer to my penultimate, my almost last question here. But if you could summarize in 1 or 2 sentences, what fundamentally do you want these readers to take away from this book?
Honestly, my biggest thing is curiosity and empathy. So much of the book is about these three generations of men who have had very intense experiences without each other, who haven't shared them. And the only way they can really come together is to fully reveal themselves to each other. But that's not going to happen if they don't offer curiosity and empathy. And to give an example from my own life, it's very much like growing up as a young, gay kid in Iranian culture. It was very hard. There was no conversation around my identity, no acceptance. And so often I felt like I wanted my parents or my Iranian elders to offer me more support, more curiosity, to ask me questions so that they could understand me. What I came to realize the older I got is I was never offering that to them. I was never asking them about their experience. And what was it like to leave Iran? What did you suffer? Why are you the way you are? And so one of the things I really believe young people should and need to hear is that, as a young person, you often want, I say this to my kids all the time, you want a certain thing from someone, you want to be treated a certain way, you want a certain kind of love or attention or affection. And the best way to receive that is to offer it. It's always a give and take. And I really, especially when it comes to between generations, which is what this book is about, and also between borders. And, if someone is from a different culture than you, don't make assumptions. Ask them what their culture is and what they're bringing with them.
Great. So to close,
Yes.
this is a really hardball one. So you've won the Lambda Literary, you've been a Stonewall owner, you've now a Stonewall winner. This is the Forest of Reading. This is a little bit different. This is a program where the kids, the readers, vote and decide the winners. How does it feel to be nominated for that kind of a program?
Oh, I mean, incredible, incredible. I mean, for me, it all comes down to the readers. I don't, and of course, look, with the Stonewall, it's librarians who are deciding, and that's so moving because, especially here in the United States where I now live, librarians are under attack. I hope it's not as bad where you are, but maybe it is.
It's
But
getting.
it's getting there. Yeah. So that's always so special to have that relationship with librarians and that validation because I see librarians as heroes. But ultimately, young readers are the audience we're writing these books for. So to know that the books are resonating is so meaningful. And also because my books are, I'm asking something of young readers. I'm asking them to take their brains to the 1930s, to the 1970s, to Iran. I'm not, this is not familiar territory for many young readers. And to know that they're taking it in and thinking about it is beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us today.
you. Thank you. It's
So
so fun.
lovely. I know that the kids that are going to be watching this are just so lucky to have the opportunity to visit with you on their screens. And I want to thank you for everything that you're doing and everything that you're writing. And I am, first in line for when that next title comes out.
Yay.
Uh,
September.
we want to remind everybody who is watching that there is the forestofreading.com, the official website, and your teachers or your librarian or your public librarian, however it is you're engaging with the Forest of Reading, can get you access to activities and schedules for author visits, and just keep reading and get ready to vote in April. Thank you.